The night air carried the scent of apple blossoms from the orchard Margaret had planted 30 years ago. Silas Harrow sat on the porch of the house he had built with his own hands, the same hands that now trembled slightly as they gripped the armrests of his rocking chair. 84 years had carved deep lines into his face, turned his hair and beard white as winter snow, but his eyes remained sharp, gray as granite, gray as the mountains that had sheltered him for 14 years of solitude. The oil lamp flickered beside him, casting dancing shadows across the wooden planks. Somewhere in the darkness beyond the porch, a coyote called to its mate. The sound echoed across the valley where Ashroot now slept 500 souls who had no idea that everything they had, everything they were began with a sound very much like that one. A cry in the wilderness, a voice begging to be heard. Samuel stood at the porch railing, his back straight in the new army uniform that still smelled of wool and starch. 19 years old, tall like Silas had been at that age. Blue eyes from his mother. But that stubborn jaw, those broad shoulders, those belonged to the Harrow line. In his hand, Samuel held a letter. He had read it so many times the paper had grown soft at the creases. Orders to report to Fort Dix, then a ship to France, then the trenches, then whatever God or fate or blind chance had waiting for him in the mud and blood of a war that had already consumed millions. Tomorrow he would board a train and leave everything he had ever known. Tonight was all they had left. Grandfather Samuel said without turning around, his voice caught, slightly betraying the fear he was trying so hard to hide. Were you scared? Back then in the war, Silas did not answer immediately. He never did. Words he had learned long ago were like bullets. You did not waste them. You made each one count. Scared, he finally said, his voice rough as gravel scraping stone. Anyone who says they were not scared is a liar. But there is something worse than fear, boy. Samuel turned to look at him. What regret? Silas let the word hang in the air between them like smoke. Regret for not standing up when you should have stood. For staying silent when you should have spoken. For walking away when you should have fought. Samuel's eyes searched his grandfather's spine. The scar that ran from his left temple down to his jaw seemed deeper in the lamplight, a pale river carved into weathered terrain. You, Samuel said slowly. You walked away once. Silas closed his eyes. His hand moved unconsciously to the scar, tracing its familiar path. A habit he had never been able to break. A reminder he had never been able to forget. Sit down, he said. His voice was quiet now, almost gentle. Let me tell you about the woman who saved me, and about the price of silence. Samuel lowered himself onto the porch steps, his uniform creaking with the movement. The coyote called again, closer now, and the wind shifted, bringing with it the smell of pine and snow from the distant peaks of the San Juan Mountains. And in the flickering lamplight, Silas Harrow became someone else. Not the old man with trembling hands and white hair, but a shadow from another time. A ghost carrying secrets heavy enough to crush mountains. It was 1878, Silas began. I was 45 years old. I had been living alone in those mountains for 14 years, ever since I walked away from everything I thought I believed in. I figured I would die up there, just another pile of bones the coyotes would scatter. Nobody would know. Nobody would care. He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice had changed, deeper, rougher. The voice of a younger man who had not yet learned that some wounds never heal. But that September, the mountains sent me a gift, or maybe a curse. Even now, I am not sure which. The sun that day was a blade. It cut through the sky above Painted Horse Canyon, turning every rock into an oven and every breath into labor. Silas moved along the dry stream bed with the practiced ease of a man who had spent more than a decade learning the mountain secrets. His left hand held a rabbit he had taken from his trap line that morning. His right hand rested on the stock of his Sharps rifle, the weapon he called Old Reliable, .45-70 caliber. Heavy enough to drop a buffalo at 500 yards. Heavy enough to remind a man that survival in these mountains was never guaranteed. He checked the trap he had set 2 days earlier. Steel jaws, number 1.5, positioned 18 inches from the water's edge and camouflaged with mud and dried leaves. A marten had finally taken the bait. Good fur. Worth $3 in Ironwood Bluff, maybe $4 if the buyer was feeling generous. Silas was reaching for the trap when he heard it. Not a sound he could identify. Not animal, not wind. Something between a gasp and a whisper, frayed at the edges like fabric stretched too far. coming from somewhere ahead where the canyon narrowed into a throat of red stone. Every instinct he had developed in 14 years of solitude told him to turn around. Let nature take its course. The mountains were full of things dying. It was not his concern. But 14 years ago, someone had ignored those same instincts. Someone had stopped for a stranger freezing in the snow. Someone had chosen mercy over convenience. Silas followed the sound. The crevice in the canyon wall was barely wide enough for his shoulders. He had to turn sideways, scraping against rough sandstone that had been carved by water and wind over countless millennia. The walls rose 60 feet on either side, turning the passage into a cathedral of stone. Shafts of sunlight pierced through cracks far above, creating columns of gold in the dusty air. And there at the base of one of those columns of light, he found her. At first, his mind refused to process what his eyes were seeing. A pile of black cloth, dried blood, so much blood it had turned the red rock beneath her nearly black. Dust and grit coating everything. And beneath it all, the shape of a woman. She was pinned beneath a slab of sandstone that must have weighed 400 pounds. Her left leg was caught from the knee, down twisted at an angle that made Silas's stomach clench. Her face was gray beneath the dirt, her lips cracked and bleeding from dehydration. But her eyes were open, dark brown, almost black, and absolutely clear. She watched him approach without flinching, without begging, without any of the desperate pleading he might have expected from someone who had been lying here for what looked like at least 8 hours, slowly dying in the merciless heat. Instead, she spoke. Her voice was a rasp, like wind against dry brush, but her words were steady. "If you have come to kill me," she said, "then please do it quickly. I will not scream. I am finished with screaming." Silas stopped 3 feet away. His hand had not moved from his rifle, but he made no motion to raise it. Instead, he studied her with the careful attention of a man who had survived by noticing details others missed. The black cloth was a habit, a nun's garment torn and filthy but unmistakable. A silver crucifix hung around her neck, glinting dully in the diffused light. But there was another cross clutched in her right hand. This one was wood rough oak, stained with something darker than dirt. Her wrists bore the marks of rope, raw red circles where she had been bound. Not once, but many times, judging by the layers of scarring beneath the fresh wounds. And there, nearly hidden in the folds of her torn cloak, he saw something that made his blood turn to ice. A piece of cloth ripped away from something larger. And on that cloth, partially obscured by dried blood, was a symbol he recognized instantly. The badge of a United States Marshal. Someone had torn it from her clothing. Or she had torn it from someone else. Silas knew of only one marshal who operated in this territory, only one man who wore that particular style of badge, and that man was someone Silas had hoped he would never see again. "I did not come to kill you," Silas said. His voice came out flat, controlled. "I came because I heard you praying." The woman's eyes flickered with something that might have been surprise. It vanished almost immediately, buried beneath the iron control she had wrapped around herself like armor. "Latin," she said. "The old prayers. They are all I have left." Silas set down his rifle. The sound of steel against stone echoed through the narrow space like a promise. He moved closer slowly, the way he would approach a wounded animal that might still have the strength to bite. "I'm going to get you out," he said, "but I need you to help me. When I lift you, pull yourself free. Do not think. Just pull." The woman looked at him for a long moment. Whatever she saw in his face must have satisfied her, because she gave a single small nod. Silas assessed the situation with the eye of a man who had survived 100 different ways to die. The boulder was tilted about 20 degrees to the left. If he pushed from the wrong angle, it would roll further onto her leg instead of away. He needed leverage. He found what he was looking for 10 feet away. A dead juniper branch about 4 feet long and 3 inches thick. Dry, but still solid. He wedged it beneath the boulder's edge, then positioned a smaller rock as a fulcrum. "When I say now," he told her. "Not before, not after." She nodded again. Silas braced himself, 175 pounds of muscle and bone, and stubborn refusal to quit. He threw everything he had into the lever, and the boulder groaned. Now she moved, both hands clawing at the dirt, dragging her body backward with a strength that seemed impossible for someone in her condition. Her face went white. Her jaw clenched so hard Silas could hear her teeth grinding. But she did not scream, just as she had promised. The boulder slammed back down with a sound like thunder trapped in a bottle. and she was free. Silas knelt beside her, his fingers probing her leg with practiced efficiency. No bone protruding through the skin. The joint at the knee seemed intact, but the muscle was badly crushed, already swelling, and there was a wound higher up on her calf that troubled him more. A bullet hole, small caliber, maybe a 36. The entry wound was clean, but the exit wound was ragged. Someone had shot her before the rock had fallen, or she had been shot while trying to escape something that had caused the rock to fall. "You know pain," he said. It was not a question. "I know pain," she agreed. "And I know it is not the worst thing that can happen." He looked at her, then really looked, and for the first time in 14 years, Silas Harrow felt something stir in the dead space where his heart used to be. "What is your name?" She hesitated. Then, as if deciding that dying women had no use for secrets, "Margaret. Sister Margaret Cole. Although I am not certain God still claims me as his own." Silas gathered her in his arms. She weighed almost nothing, 105 pounds at most, and most of that was the weight of her waterlogged habit. She stiffened at his touch, every muscle tensing with instinctive resistance. "I am not going to hurt you," he said. She did not relax, but she did not fight him either. The journey back to his cabin was 2.3 miles of rough terrain, climbing 800 feet through loose shale and stubborn juniper. Silas stopped every 15 minutes to check her pulse, every 30 minutes to drip water from his canteen onto her cracked lips. He tore a strip from his own shirt and bound it around her thigh to slow the bleeding tight enough to help but not tight enough to kill the limb. She lost consciousness twice. Both times she spoke in her delirium, names tumbling from her lips like prayers. Sarah, Elizabeth, Grace, and another name spoken with a hatred so pure it made Silas's jaw tighten. Blackwood, that name. 14 years he had tried to bury it. 14 years he had tried to forget. And now here it was again, carried on the breath of a dying woman in the middle of nowhere. The cabin appeared through the trees as the sun began its descent toward the western peaks. 12 feet by 14 feet, built of cedar logs Silas had felled and notched himself. A roof of bark that kept out the rain. One window facing east to catch the morning light. Inside the accumulated possessions of a man who had given up on everything except survival. One bed, one chair, one table, a cast iron stove, and on the wall a photograph in a wooden frame faded by years of smoke and solitude. A young woman with gentle eyes, a baby in her arms. Silas kicked open the door and carried Margaret inside. He laid her on the bed, the only bed, and immediately set to work. Back in Ash Root 1917, Samuel sat motionless on the porch steps. The coyote had fallen silent, but somewhere in the distance, an owl called its voice, floating across the sleeping valley like a ghost. "Blackwood," Samuel repeated. Who was he? Silas's hand had gone back to his scar. In the lamplight, his eyes looked hollow, haunted by something that 39 years had not been able to erase. "He was the man who taught me that walking away is never enough," Silas said. "The man who showed me that silence in the face of evil is the same as agreement." "What did he do to you?" Silas was quiet for a long moment. Then he reached into his pocket and withdrew something small. A ring, silver tarnished with age but still readable. The inscription on the inside caught the lamplight. E and S. Forever. "He almost killed me," Silas said. And 14 years later, he came back to finish the job. But that night in the cabin, I did not know it yet. All I knew was that I had a wounded woman in my bed and a name on her lips that I had hoped I would never hear again. He slipped the ring back into his pocket. "Let me tell you what happened next." The fire crackled in the cast iron stove, throwing dancing shadows across the cabin walls. Silas worked by the combined light of the flames in a single tallow candle, his hands moving with a confidence born of necessity. He had learned medicine the hard way, not from books or schools, but from the Ute family who had saved his life in the winter of 1864. They had taught him which plants healed and which plants killed, how to set a bone, how to stop bleeding, how to draw a poison from a wound that had begun to turn green. First, he cleaned her leg, boiled water with strips of white willow bark, which the Ute called the pain tree for the relief it could provide. He used clean linen to wipe away the dirt and debris, working carefully around the bullet wound and the massive bruising where the boulder had crushed her muscle. Then he made a poultice, yarrow leaves crushed to release their juices. Wild honey he had harvested from a hive 2 weeks earlier. a paste of white clay from the stream bed, which drew out infection the way a sponge drew water. He spread the mixture thick across her wounds, then bound everything with more linen strips. Two straight sticks braced her leg from knee to ankle secured with leather thongs. By the time he finished, 3 hours had passed. His back ached from bending over her. His hands were stained with her blood in the green residue of crushed herbs, and she was awake. Her eyes tracked his movements as he crossed to the table and poured 2 cups of water. She had positioned herself against the wall, her gaze sweeping the cabin with the practiced assessment of someone who had spent too much time calculating escape routes. The door, the window, his rifle leaning against the wall 6 feet away, his knife sheathed at his belt. She was already planning how to run if she had to, even though she could barely sit up, even though her leg would not support her weight for weeks. That more than anything else told Silas what kind of woman he was dealing with. He handed her the water. She took it with both hands but did not drink immediately, testing for poison perhaps, or simply too wary to accept anything without examination. "What is your name?" she asked. Her voice was stronger now, though still rough from dehydration. "Silas." "Silas what, Harrow?" Something flickered in her eyes. Recognition, he could not be sure. "The lonely man in the mountains," she said. "I have heard of you." That surprised him. He had not been down to Ironwood Bluff in over a year, had not spoken to another human being in nearly 8 months. He had assumed the world had forgotten he existed. "What have you heard? That you were a soldier once? That you walked away from something terrible? That you live up here because you cannot stand the sight of other people?" Silas said nothing. There was nothing to say. Every word of it was true. He settled into the single chair, keeping his body between her and the rifle. Not because he thought she would try to use it, but because old habits died hard, and positioning himself near exits and weapons was as natural to him as breathing. "Why were you in the canyon?" he asked. "I was running." "From whom?" Her jaw tightened. For a moment he thought she would not answer. Then she said a name that hit him like a fist to the gut. Josiah Blackwood. Silas did not move, did not breathe. The fire popped and crackled, but inside the cabin time itself seemed to have frozen. "You know him," Margaret said. It was not a question, and Silas, who had not spoken about Sand Creek to anyone in 14 years, found himself talking. November 1864, Sand Creek, Colorado Territory. 700 soldiers under the command of Colonel John Chivington marching toward a village of Cheyenne and Arapaho who had been promised protection by the United States government. Silas was 31 years old that winter, a scout hired for his knowledge of the territory and his ability to move through it unseen. He had spent 3 years guiding Army patrols through lands that most white men could not survive, and he had told himself that he was doing important work. Necessary work. The work of building a nation. The night before the attack, Chivington sent Silas ahead to observe the village. What he found there haunted him still. Not warriors, not a war party preparing for battle, just families. Women cooking over fires, children playing in the snow, old men telling stories to grandchildren. A village of 700 souls, most of the fighting men away on a hunting expedition that would keep them gone for another week. Silas reported back to his commanding officer, a young lieutenant named Josiah Blackwood, 28 years old with eyes the color of a frozen lake and a smile that never quite reached them. "These are not combatants," Silas said. "These are families, women and children." Blackwood's smile widened. "Orders are orders, Harrow. We attack at dawn. Total elimination. I will not be part of this." "Then you are a traitor." They beat him with rifle butts until his ribs cracked. They tied him to a post outside the command tent while the temperature dropped to 15 degrees below zero. Blackwood himself came out just before midnight, his breath fogging in the air, that terrible smile still on his face. "Freeze slowly, Harrow. Plenty of time to regret your choice." In the morning, Silas listened to the massacre. The gunfire, the screaming, the sounds that no amount of time could ever erase. 230 people died that day, mostly women, mostly children. And Silas Harrow lay tied to a post, unable to move, unable to help slowly dying in the snow. A Ute hunting party found him the next afternoon. They cut him free, carried him to their camp, and spent 3 months nursing him back to health. When he could finally walk again, the war was over. Sand Creek was history, and Josiah Blackwood had vanished into the chaos of Reconstruction Just another monster set loose in a land full of monsters. Silas went into the mountains and did not come out. Until now, back in 1917, Silas paused in his telling. His hand had not left the scar on his face, tracing its path again and again like a rosary. Samuel sat absolutely still, his face pale in the lamplight. 230 people, he said quietly. Women and children, Silas confirmed. And I did nothing. I refused to participate, yes, but I did not stop them. I did not fight. I let them tie me up, and I lay there in the snow while they committed murder. You were one man against 700. I was a coward who told himself that refusing was enough. Silas's voice was flat, emotionless, but his eyes burned with a fire that 39 years had not extinguished. It is never enough, Samuel. Refusing evil is not the same as fighting it. Walking away is not the same as standing up. And silence, even well-meaning silence, is still silence. The old man leaned forward in his chair. That is the first lesson. Remember it when you get to France. Remember it when you have to decide what kind of man you are going to be. Samuel nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving his grandfather's face. What happened next with the nun, with Blackwood? Silas settled back. Outside, the first hint of gray was beginning to touch the eastern horizon. Dawn was coming. Samuel's train would leave in 4 hours. She told me why Blackwood was hunting her, Silas said. And that was when I understood that God, fate, or whatever you want to call it, had given me a second chance. In the cabin in 1878, the fire had burned down to embers. Margaret had eaten a little of the dried meat Silas offered, drunk 2 cups of water, and some color had returned to her face. But her eyes remained wary, constantly checking the exits, never quite relaxing. St. Catherine's Convent, she said. Santa Fe, I was there for 13 years. I thought it was a sanctuary. She paused, and when she continued, her voice had taken on an edge of cold fury. Mother Superior Sister Agatha had an arrangement with Blackwood. The orphan girls we took and the ones with no families, no one to ask questions about them. She was selling them to him. For his mining camps, he said. But I knew what really happened to those girls. Silas said nothing. He had seen enough of the world to know that evil wore many faces, and some of the worst monsters hid behind crosses and collars. 6 months ago, I discovered the truth. Account books, records, names and dates and amounts. Margaret's hand went to the crucifix at her throat, but her grip was more angry than prayerful. I took 7 girls and ran, through the desert at night, toward the border. What happened? Her voice broke for the first time. Only for a moment, but Silas heard it. Grace, 16 years old. Blackwood caught up with us near the Rio Grande. She was shot trying to distract them so the others could escape. She died in my arms. She held up the wooden crucifix that Silas had noticed earlier. The one stained with something darker than dirt. This was hers. I carry it to remember. To never forget what he took from us. Silas looked at the crucifix, then at the woman holding it. A nun who had risked everything to save children from a monster. A woman who had watched a girl die in her arms and kept running anyway. A survivor who, even now pinned under a rock and bleeding out in the desert, had not begged for her life. She had simply asked him to make it quick. The other 6 girls, Silas said. Where are they now, hiding? Different places, waiting for me to finish what I started. Margaret reached into her habit and withdrew a small, leather-bound book. Its pages swollen with dried water damage, but still intact. This is everything. Every transaction, every name, every payment Blackwood made to Sister Agatha. If this reaches the federal court in Denver, if Judge Morrison sees it, Blackwood will hang. And you are the only one who can deliver it. I am the only one who knows where all the girls are hiding. If I die, they stay hidden forever. Too afraid to come out. Too afraid to testify. Silas looked at the book, then at the woman, then at the fire dying in the stove. He thought about 14 years of silence, 14 years of hiding, 14 years of telling himself that walking away had been enough. It had never been enough, and now, as if the mountains themselves had decided to give him one final chance here, was an opportunity to stand up instead of walking away, to fight instead of hiding, to finally, after all these years, do something that mattered. They will come looking for you, he said. They have been looking for me for 6 months. They will find you eventually. Yes, and anyone helping you will die alongside you. Margaret met his eyes. Hers were clear, unflinching, accepting. Yes. Silas stood. He crossed to the wall where his rifle leaned and picked it up. For a long moment, he simply held it, feeling its familiar weight, remembering all the things he had done with this weapon and all the things he had failed to do. Then he began checking the ammunition. Margaret watched him without speaking. When he finished and slung the rifle over his shoulder, she finally asked the question, "Why? Because I let people die once by doing nothing." Silas's voice was quiet, but something had changed in it. Something that had been dead for 14 years was stirring back to life. "I will not make that mistake again." The next morning, Silas left Margaret in the cabin with one of his old Colt Navy revolvers and clear instructions. "If anyone except him comes through that door, you shoot. No questions. No hesitation." She nodded once, her grip on the pistol steady despite her weakness. Silas moved south away from the cabin, using the skills the Ute had taught him and the instincts 14 years of solitude had sharpened to a razor's edge. He did not walk on ridgelines where his silhouette would be visible against the sky. He did not follow trails where an ambush could be waiting around any bend. Instead, he moved parallel to everything, keeping 20 to 30 feet off any obvious path, stopping every few minutes to listen. An hour and a half later, he found what he was looking for. 3 horses had stopped here recently. The manure was still fresh, less than 24 hours old. Grass had been trampled where the animals grazed while their riders did something else. Brass shell casings gleamed in the dirt. 44-40 caliber. Winchester ammunition. Someone had test-fired their weapon, and there, caught on a spine of prickly pear cactus, was a scrap of black cloth, the same material as Margaret's habit. Silas read the tracks with the ease of long practice. 3 riders, 1 large man, boot size 11, 2 smaller men. They had gone east, initially away from his cabin, but the tracks curved gradually northward. They were circling, searching. They did not know exactly where his cabin was, not yet, but they were getting closer. 2 days, maybe 3, before they found it. He gathered the brass casings and the scrap of cloth, then headed back the way he had come. Margaret needed to know, and they needed to move. That night, as they prepared to leave, Margaret asked him a question that stopped him cold. "Is there anyone who can help us?" Silas was quiet for a long moment. Then he said a name he had not spoken aloud in over a decade. Elijah Crowfeather. He lives higher in the mountains in a place few people know about. He is Ute. A medicine man now, but he was a warrior once. "Will he help? He saved my life 14 years ago." Silas looked toward the window, toward the mountains rising black against the stars. "If anyone can help us disappear, it is him." They left at midnight. Silas led Midnight, his black gelding, along paths that did not appear on any map. Margaret rode in the saddle, her wounded leg bound tightly to prevent movement, her hands gripping the pommel with white-knuckled determination. The canyon narrowed as they climbed walls of red stone, rising on either side like the ribs of some enormous beast. Silas had used this route many times over the years, but he had never brought another person through it. The passage was too narrow, too treacherous, too likely to become a death trap if anything went wrong. But it was also the fastest way to reach Elijah's territory. And right now, speed mattered more than safety. They entered the passage called the Devil's Throat just after 2 in the morning. The walls were so close that Silas had to turn sideways to squeeze through, leading Midnight by the reins, and hoping the gelding would not panic in the confined space. The air was cool and still untouched by wind, thick with the smell of ancient stone. Margaret had not spoken in over an hour, but now as they moved deeper into the throat, she broke the silence. "Do you believe in God?" Silas did not turn around. "I believe in the mountains, in snow, in things I can see and touch. But you saved me. You do not need God to know what is right." "Maybe," she said softly, "maybe that is how he works." They were near the exit when Silas stopped. His hand went up, signaling Margaret to be still. Midnight's ears pricked forward, nostrils flaring. Silas sniffed the air, an old habit one the Ute had taught him. Scent carried information that eyes could miss. Smoke, water, animals, and sometimes things that did not belong. Tobacco smoke. Fresh. Someone was waiting at the other end of the passage. "Get down," he whispered. Margaret slid from the saddle, biting back a cry as her leg took weight. Silas pointed to a narrow crack in the canyon wall, barely wide enough for one person. "Hide there." She did not argue. In seconds, she had vanished into the crack, swallowed by darkness. Silas pulled his Sharps rifle from its scabbard and checked the chamber. 1 round. That was all the Sharps held. One shot, then a reload that took at least 10 seconds. Against multiple opponents, it was not enough. But he had other weapons. The Bowie knife on his belt, the hatchet in his saddlebag, and 14 years of learning how to survive in country that killed most men within months. He moved forward toward the faint glow of starlight that marked the passage's exit, and a voice spoke from the darkness ahead. Smooth as worn leather, cold as mountain snow, Silas Harrow. It has been a long time. Blackwood stood 50 feet from the canyon's mouth, silhouetted against the starlit sky. He was alone, no weapon visible in his hands, that terrible smile playing at the corners of his mouth. 14 years had aged him. His hair was streaked with gray, now his face more lined. But his eyes had not changed. Blue as ice, empty as a grave. I always knew you were still alive, Blackwood said. Heard rumors over the years. The hermit in the San Juans, the ghost who watched from the peaks. I knew someday you would get in my way again. Silas raised the sharps, its barrel steady despite the rage building in his chest. Where are your men behind you? Blackwood's smile widened. Coming through the other end of the passage right now. You are trapped, Harrow, just like before. Only this time there is no snow, just rock, and a bullet with your name on it. Silas heard them now, footsteps echoing in the throat behind him. 3 men, maybe 4, moving fast. She is not worth dying for, Blackwood called. A runaway nun, a thief. She stole my property and now she has to pay for it. Those girls were not property. Everything is property if you have the strength to take it. That is the law of this world, Harrow. You refused to understand it 14 years ago, and you still refuse to understand it now. Silas's finger tightened on the trigger. 50 feet. At this range, with this rifle, he could put a hole through Blackwood's chest big enough to fit a fist. But the men behind him would be on top of Margaret before Silas could reload. And then from the ridge above, a rifle cracked. One of Blackwood's men approaching through the throat behind Silas crumpled without a sound. Blood sprayed across the narrow walls. Blackwood's smile vanished. His hand went to his holster, but he did not draw. Instead, he looked up toward the source of the shot, and for the first time, Silas saw something like uncertainty flicker across his face. On the canyon rim, outlined against the stars, stood a figure that seemed to have materialized from the rock itself. Long white hair streaming in the wind. A Winchester rifle held steady in weathered hands. A face like carved granite, ancient and implacable. Harrow. The voice echoed down into the throat like thunder. You owe me a buck deer from last winter. I am collecting. Elijah Crowfeather had arrived. Blackwood made a sound that might have been a curse. He threw himself backward, vanishing into the darkness beyond the canyon's mouth. Get them out of there, Blackwood shouted to his remaining men. Kill Harrow. Bring me the woman alive. But the chaos had already begun. Elijah's second shot took another of Blackwood's men through the shoulder, spinning him around in a spray of blood. Silas turned toward the throat, toward the footsteps still coming, and fired the sharps. The massive rifle roared. The bullet caught the first man's center mass and kept going, punching through him and into the rock wall behind. He was dead before he hit the ground. The second man came around the body of his companion, pistol raised, but Silas was already moving. The Bowie knife left its sheath and buried itself in the man's throat before he could squeeze the trigger. For a moment, there was only silence. The smell of gunpowder and blood filled the narrow passage like fog. Then Elijah's voice floated down from above. They are retreating. For now. Silas pulled his knife free and wiped it on the dead man's shirt. Then he went to find Margaret. She emerged from the crack in the wall on her own power, supporting herself against the stone, her face pale but her eyes steady. Silas looked at her, looked at the bodies, looked up at the ridge where Elijah was already climbing down with the agility of a man half his age. We need to go, he said. Margaret nodded. Then as Elijah reached them, she asked the question that had been waiting behind her eyes since the first shot was fired. Why, she asked the old Ute. Why help us? Elijah studied her for a long moment. His face was unreadable, carved by 71 years of sun and wind and hard living. 14 years ago, he finally said, I saved a man who was waiting to die. I still have not decided if that was the right choice. He looked at Silas, then back at Margaret, then at the darkness where Blackwood had disappeared. Tonight I find out. He turned and began leading them up a path that seemed to exist only for him, vanishing into the mountains like a ghost. And Silas followed Margaret's weight against his side, 3 bodies cooling in the canyon behind them, and the knowledge burning in his chest that this was only the beginning. Blackwood would return. He always did. And next time he would bring more men, more guns, more of the cold, calculating cruelty that had made him a legend among those who traded in human flesh. But for now, they were alive. For now, they had a chance. And for the first time in 14 years, Silas Harrow felt something other than emptiness in his heart. It felt like purpose. It felt like redemption. It felt, though he would never have admitted it, like hope. Back in Ashroot, the clock on the mantel had just struck 11. The night had grown colder, and Samuel had retrieved a blanket from inside the house, wrapping it around his shoulders as he listened to his grandfather's voice weave through the darkness like smoke. Silas paused in his telling, reaching for the cup of water his grandson had brought him. His throat was dry from talking, but there was more to say. So much more. Elijah Crow, Feather Samuel said quietly, I have never heard that name before, because he did not want to be remembered. Silas set the cup down on the arm of his rocking chair. He used to say that people who live too long should not leave tracks, like wind through the mountains. Come and go without anyone knowing. Is he still alive? Silas shook his head slowly. The motion seemed to cost him something, as if the memory itself carried physical weight. No, he died that year. But the way he died. Silas closed his eyes for a moment. That is what I want you to remember most. That is the lesson I need you to carry with you to France. Samuel leaned forward, the blanket slipping from one shoulder. What happened to him? Let me tell you about the cave first, about the things he taught us there, and about the choice he made at the end. Elijah led them through the darkness for 3 hours, following paths that seemed to exist only in his memory. The terrain grew steeper with every mile, the air thinner, the temperature dropping until their breath came out in clouds of white mist. Margaret rode midnight in silence, her wounded leg throbbing with each step the horse took. But she did not complain. She had stopped complaining about pain somewhere around her 15th year when the nuns at St. Catherine's had taught her that suffering was a gift from God meant to purify the soul. She was no longer certain she believed that, but the habit of silence remained. Silas walked beside the horse, one hand on the reins, his eyes constantly moving across the terrain. Behind them, somewhere in the darkness, Blackwood was regrouping, counting his dead, planning his next move. They had bought themselves time, but time, Silas knew, was a currency that always ran out. The entrance to Elijah's cave was hidden behind a waterfall. Not a large one, just a thin curtain of water falling from a crack in the rock face barely visible in the pre-dawn light. But to reach the cave, you had to walk through it. Let the water soak you to the bone. Accept the mountain's baptism before it would reveal its secrets. Elijah went first, disappearing through the silver curtain without hesitation. Silas helped Margaret down from midnight, then guided her through the water, while the cold stabbed at them like 1,000 needles. On the other side, they found themselves in a cathedral of stone. The cave was enormous, 40 feet wide, 30 feet deep, with a ceiling that rose 25 feet above the floor. Cracks in the rock far overhead let in thin shafts of light, creating columns of pale gold that shifted and moved as the sun climbed higher outside. The walls were covered with paintings, hundreds of them, images in red and black and white that told stories Silas could only guess at. Hunts, battles, births, deaths, the entire history of a people written on stone. The air smelled of herbs and smoke, and something older than memory. In the center of the cave, a small fire burned in a ring of stones. Around it sat leather pouches filled with roots and leaves and powders, the accumulated medicine of 71 years of healing. Elijah was already kneeling beside the fire, adding wood, coaxing the flames higher. He did not look up when he spoke. Bring her here. Silas helped Margaret to a spot near the fire, easing her down onto a pile of furs that seemed to have been placed there specifically for this purpose. As if Elijah had known they were coming. As if the mountain had told him. Perhaps it had. Silas had long since stopped questioning the things Elijah seemed to know. The old Ute examined Margaret's leg with hands that were surprisingly gentle for someone who had once been a warrior. His fingers probed the swelling, tested the range of motion in her knee, traced the path of the bullet wound. White man's medicine uses fire and steel, he said without looking up. But the earth has its own ways. He began preparing a poultice. Silas watched, recognizing some of the ingredients from his own time with the Ute. Echinacea root dried and ground to powder, which fought infection and strengthened the body's own defenses. Comfrey leaves, which the Ute called knitbone for its ability to help torn flesh mend. red clay from deep within the mountain, which drew out poison and killed the tiny creatures that caused wounds to fester. Elijah mixed these with water from a spring somewhere deeper in the cave water, so cold it numbed the fingers, and applied the resulting paste to Margaret's wounds with the careful precision of a man who had done this 1,000 times. She gasped when the mixture first touched her skin. The cold was like a knife, but within minutes the swelling began to visibly decrease. This woman carries more than one wound, Elijah said quietly as he worked. There is something following her. Not a man, a darkness. I saw it in my dreams 3 nights ago. It will not stop until one of them falls. Margaret looked at the old man, her eyes unreadable. I carry the names of the dead, she said, so no one forgets. Elijah nodded slowly. Good, the dead need the living to remember. Otherwise, they are only dust. That night after Margaret had fallen into an exhausted sleep near the fire, Silas and Elijah sat together at the cave's entrance, watching the stars wheel overhead through the curtain of falling water. Tell me, Silas said, why did you come? The mountains whispered. Elijah's voice was as rough as gravel worn down by decades of wind and cold. They told me blood would flow. I followed the sound. You could have stayed hidden. Let us die. Yes. Why did you not? Elijah was silent for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice had changed, softer, more distant, as if he were speaking from somewhere far away. I was a warrior once. My name then was Running Bear. I killed 13 men in battle defending land that had belonged to my people since before memory. He held up his hands, turning them in the starlight. These hands took lives, many lives. I was proud of this. But in the winter of 1858, I found a white man dying in the snow, a trapper whose horse had fallen through ice. I could have walked past, let the cold take him. What did you do? I looked into his eyes, and I saw not fear, not begging, only acceptance. He was ready to die without pleading for mercy. Like her, Silas said. Like her. Elijah lowered his hands. Something in that acceptance made me stop. I brought him to my camp, healed him. And I learned that not all white men are the same, just as not all Ute are the same. He turned to look at Silas, his eyes reflecting the distant fire. Good and evil do not live in skin color. They live in the heart. And the heart is the only thing the spirits care about. Margaret's voice came from behind them, soft but clear. She had awakened without either of them noticing. Do you believe in redemption, she asked? That people who have done wrong can be forgiven. Elijah studied the fire for a long time before answering. Forgiveness is not my work. That belongs to spirits greater than me, but I believe in change. I believe people can become better if they choose. He looked directly at Margaret, his gaze piercing. The question is, are you willing to choose the second night in the cave? Elijah went to check his trap lines, leaving Silas and Margaret alone by the fire. It was the first time they had truly been alone since leaving the cabin, and the silence between them felt different now. Heavier, more meaningful. Did you ever have a family? Margaret asked. Silas did not answer immediately. The fire crackled and popped, sending sparks spiraling upward toward the distant ceiling. Yes, he finally said. Once. Eleanor, my wife, Mary, my daughter. Where are they now, dead? His voice was flat as frozen water. Typhoid fever, 1862. I was at Antietam helping the army cross the river. By the time I got home, they had been buried for 3 weeks. I am sorry. Do not be. It was not your fault. It was not anyone's fault. Some things just happen. He stared into the flames, his jaw tight. That was when I stopped believing. In God, in country, in people. Only the mountains remained. Mountains do not betray you. Margaret was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I entered the convent because I had nowhere else to go. My parents died when I was 12. Cholera. I wandered from town to town until the sisters found me. Do you regret it? The religious life? Numb. The convent gave me purpose. Peace, hope. Her voice dropped. Until I discovered the truth. Until I learned that evil can hide anywhere, even behind sacred walls. She reached up and touched the wooden crucifix around her neck. Grace's crucifix. I promised myself I would never forget what Blackwood took. I would carry her with me until justice was done, or until I died trying. Silas looked at her then, really looked, at the strength in her jaw, the fire in her eyes. The way she held herself despite the pain, despite the fear, despite everything that had been done to her. You are not like other nuns I have met. I am not sure I am a nun anymore. Margaret met his gaze without flinching. But I am still someone who believes that wrong should be made right. Without thinking, Silas reached out and touched the scar on her wrist. The rope burns, the marks of captivity that she would carry for the rest of her life. She did not pull away. You carry many scars, she said softly, her eyes moving to the line that ran down his face. Everyone has scars. The difference is where they are. Mine cannot be seen. She paused. But they hurt no less. They sat like that for a moment, hands almost touching, fire-warming faces that had known too much cold. Then Silas withdrew his hand and stood. We should sleep, he said. Tomorrow will be hard. But when he walked to the other side of the cave and settled against the stone wall, he did not close his eyes for a longer time, and neither did she. Far to the south in a town called Ironwood Bluff, a different kind of fire was burning. The town had seen better days. Gold had played out 5 years ago, leaving behind a population of 340 people who had nowhere else to go, unemployed miners, drifters, women who sold the only thing they had left to sell, a general store, a saloon, a church that no one attended anymore, and a sheriff's office where Thomas Brennan sat behind his desk nursing a cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. Brennan was 55 years old with hair that had turned gray before its time and eyes that had seen too much to believe in happy endings. 23 years ago, he had served alongside Silas Harrow in the Union Army. They had watched each other's backs through Bull Run and Antietam and a dozen smaller engagements that history would never remember. Then came Sand Creek and everything changed. Brennan had not been there that day. He had been recovering from a bullet wound in a hospital in Denver. But he had heard what happened. Everyone heard. And he had watched as men like Josiah Blackwood walked away without consequences, their crimes buried beneath paperwork and politics and the convenient fiction that Indians were not really people. Now Blackwood rode into Ironwood Bluff like a king returning to his kingdom. 9 men behind him instead of 12, blood on their clothes, fury in their eyes. Brennan met him on the porch of the sheriff's office, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. Marshal Blackwood, he said, heard you lost some men. Accidents happen. Blackwood's voice was smooth as snake oil, but his eyes were cold. I am looking for a murderer, a woman dressed as a nun. She killed one of my deputies. I have not seen any nuns. She may be in the mountains, with a man named Harrow. You know him. Brennan kept his face neutral, but his heart was hammering against his ribs. Silas Harrow, he lives alone, does not cause trouble. He is causing trouble now. Blackwood stepped closer, his voice dropping to a whisper meant only for Brennan. Listen to me, Sheriff. I know you and Harrow served together. I know you are hiding something. But understand this, anyone who stands between me and that woman will be buried beside her, even men who wear badges. Brennan said nothing, but his hand tightened on his pistol, and somewhere deep in him, a voice that sounded like his younger self whispered that maybe, just maybe, this was the moment he had been waiting for. A chance to do what Silas had tried to do 14 years ago. A chance to stand up instead of walking away. On the third day, Elijah led them deeper into the mountain. The path he followed was not marked on any map. It had been carved by his ancestors thousands of years ago, a route that led through the highest passes of the San Juan Range and down into the valleys beyond. Few white men had ever walked it. Fewer still had survived. They climbed through terrain that seemed designed to kill. Shale slopes where every step threatened to send them tumbling into oblivion. Ice fields where a wrong move meant a broken leg or worse. Cliffs so sheer that Silas had to lead Midnight along ledges barely wide enough for the horse's hooves, Margaret clinging to the saddle with white-knuckled determination. The altitude was brutal. Above 10,000 feet, every breath became a struggle. Above 12,000, even Silas found himself gasping, his lungs burning, his heart pounding against his ribs like a prisoner trying to escape. But Margaret did not complain. Her leg was healing thanks to Elijah's medicine, but she was still weak. Every step cost her something. Yet she kept moving, kept pushing, kept refusing to give up. Stubborn, Silas said during one of their brief rest stops. Determined, she corrected. On the second day of the journey, they encountered an obstacle that seemed insurmountable. A rockslide had blocked the path completely, tons of stone, piled in a wall that stretched from canyon floor to canyon rim. Elijah studied the blockage for several minutes. Then he pointed to a crack in the cliff face to their left. Through there, he said, "The Howling Wind Cave. It leads to the other side." Silas felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. He had heard of this place. The Ute believed it was where the spirits of fallen warriors waited to be guided to the next world. They said the wind through the cave made sounds like weeping, like voices calling out in languages that no living person could understand. "Is there another way?" Silas asked. Yes, Elijah's eyes were unreadable. 3 days longer. She will not survive it. They entered the cave. The darkness inside was absolute. They had brought torches, pitch-soaked rags wrapped around sticks, but the light seemed to penetrate only a few feet before being swallowed by the black. The cave floor was smooth, worn down by water that had flowed through this passage for millions of years. Stalactites hung from the ceiling like teeth in a massive mouth. Stalagmites rose from the floor like gravestones in an underground cemetery. And the wind, dear God, the wind. It came from somewhere deep within the mountain, a current of cold air that moaned and wailed as it passed through cracks and crevices in the stone. The sound was almost human, almost words, almost recognizable. Silas felt the hair on the back of his neck rise. Beside him, Margaret was praying under her breath, her lips moving in the familiar rhythm of Latin that she had known since childhood. Even Midnight was nervous, his ears flat against his skull, his eyes rolling with fear. Only Elijah seemed unaffected. He moved through the darkness with the confidence of a man who had walked this path before, who knew every turn and every danger. They were almost to the exit when the explosion came. Not gunpowder, rock, the sound of stones splitting, cracking, falling. Someone had followed them. Someone had found the cave entrance, and now they had triggered a collapse. "Run!" Elijah shouted. Silas grabbed Margaret's arm and pulled her forward as the ceiling began to disintegrate above them. Rocks the size of horses fell around them, smashing against the floor with sounds like thunder. Dust filled the air, choking them, blinding them. Ahead he could see light, the exit, safety. Behind him he heard a scream. Silas turned. Through the dust he saw Elijah. A boulder the size of a wagon had caught the old man's legs, pinning him to the ground. He was trying to pull himself free, but the weight was too great. "Go!" Elijah shouted. "Get her out!" "No!" Silas ran back, fighting against the debris still falling around them. He grabbed Elijah under the arms and pulled with everything he had. The boulder shifted. Just an inch. Just enough. Elijah screamed as his legs came free. Silas could feel blood, hot and wet, soaking through the old man's clothing. But there was no time to assess the damage. Silas lifted Elijah onto his shoulder and ran. They burst out of the cave just as the entrance collapsed behind them, sealing the passage forever in a roar of falling stone. For a long moment, none of them moved. They lay on the rocky ground outside the cave, gasping for breath, covered in dust and blood. Then Silas turned to look at Elijah, and his heart sank. The old man's legs were shattered. Ribs were visible through torn flesh on his right side. He was coughing blood each breath, a wet rattle that spoke of collapsed lungs and internal damage beyond any medicine's ability to heal. Elijah looked up at the sky, at the stars just beginning to appear in the darkening blue. "Well," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "I suppose I will not be returning to my mountain after all." They made camp under a rocky outcropping with red mesa visible in the distance, a flat expanse of rust-colored stone that seemed to glow in the fading light. Elijah lay beside the fire, his breathing growing more labored with each passing hour. Margaret had done what she could with the medical supplies they carried, but it was not enough. It would never be enough. Silas sat beside his old friend, the man who had saved his life 14 years ago. The man who had taught him that survival was not the same as living. The man who had shown him that even in a world full of monsters, there were still people worth saving, and people worth dying for. "Harrow," Elijah whispered. Silas leaned closer. "There is something I need you to promise. Anything. Do not go back to the silence. Do not lose what you have found." Elijah's eyes moved to Margaret, who sat on the other side of the fire watching them. Men were not meant to live alone. Mountains can be a home, but only people can make a family. You are talking about her. I am talking about you, about something inside you that died when your wife and daughter were taken. But it is coming back to life. I can see it. Do not kill it again. Silas swallowed hard. The words caught in his throat like stones. "I will try. Do not try, do. As dawn approached, Elijah called Margaret to his side. She knelt beside him, her hand taking his, her eyes bright with tears she would not let fall. You carry the burden of the lost, Elijah said, but do not let it pull you down. They do not want you to die for them. They want you to live, to tell their story, to make sure they are remembered. I will, Margaret whispered. I promise. Elijah smiled. It transformed his face, erasing years of pain and loss and hard living. Good. I will tell the spirits that someone is coming to speak for them. They will wait. His eyes closed. His breathing slowed. And then so gently that they almost missed it, Elijah Crow. Feather stopped breathing altogether. When Silas reached into the old man's coat to retrieve his medicine pouch, his fingers touched something unexpected. A ring. Silver tarnished with age with an inscription on the inside that made his heart stop. E and S. Forever. Eleanor's wedding ring. The ring Silas had been wearing when Blackwood's men had left him to freeze in the snow 14 years ago. He never told me, Silas whispered. All these years, he had it all along. He knew who you were, Margaret said softly, from the beginning. He saved you because he saw something worth saving. Silas clutched the ring in his fist, and for the first time since Eleanor and Mary had died, he wept. Back in Ashroot, the night had grown colder still. Samuel had stopped asking questions. He simply listened, his young face illuminated by the dying lamplight, his eyes reflecting the weight of the story his grandfather was telling. Silas rose slowly from his rocking chair and walked to the porch railing. For a moment, he simply stood there looking out at the valley where Ashroot slept. Elijah taught me something that night, he said quietly. That saving someone is not the end of the story. It is the beginning. When you save a life, you bind yourself to that life. You cannot walk away. You cannot forget. You have to stay and see what they become. He turned back to face his grandson. That is why I stayed with your grandmother. That is why I helped build this town. That is why I am telling you this story now. Samuel nodded slowly. Because you want me to understand. I want you to know that every choice matters. Every time you stand up or walk away. Every time you speak or stay silent. You are deciding who you are. And that decision follows you forever. The old man returned to his chair, settling into it with a sigh. We buried Elijah under a lone oak tree at the edge of Red Mesa. Silas continued, said words over him in English and you in Latin. Then Margaret and I walked down into the valley below, and that is when we found them. Red Mesa spread out before them like a wound in the earth. Rust-colored stone, ancient and weathered, surrounding a valley where the ruins of an old Spanish trading post crumbled in the morning sun. But the ruins were not empty. Smoke rose from cooking fires. The sound of voices carried on the wind. And as Silas and Margaret approached, hands went to weapons and eyes filled with fear. Then a woman stepped forward from among the ruins. 42 years old, thin as a fence rail with gray streaking her brown hair and lines carved deep around her mouth and eyes. But there was no fear in her gaze. Only exhaustion, and beneath that something that looked like hope. My name is Ruth McAllister, she said. We heard rumors about a nun who was fighting Blackwood, about a man helping her. Silas's hand rested on his rifle, but he did not raise it. How many of you are there, 23? Ruth looked back at the people behind her. Women and children mostly, a few old men. We were farmers, ranchers. Blackwood burned us out, killed my husband because he would not sell our land. What do you want from us? A place to stand. Ruth's voice was steady despite everything. We have nowhere else to go. We thought maybe we could help. Maybe together we would have a chance. Margaret stepped forward, her eyes moving over the refugees. Hollow faces, tattered clothing, children with old eyes and young faces. This is not just our story anymore, she said softly to Silas. This is theirs too. And in that moment, something shifted inside Silas. Something that had been dead for 14 years finally broke through the frozen ground and began to grow. He lowered his rifle. Tell us everything, he said to Ruth, from the beginning. That night, they gathered around the largest fire-making plans that seemed impossible and desperate and necessary all at the same time. The ledger must reach Denver, Margaret said. If Judge Morrison sees it, Blackwood will hang. And once he is arrested, the other girls can come out of hiding. They can testify. But these people cannot travel that far. Ruth objected. The children, the elderly, they will die on the trail. Then we split up. Silas's voice cut through the argument. Margaret goes to Denver with 2 volunteers. Fast riders, no baggage. The rest of us stay here. Stay here, Ruth looked around at the crumbling walls, the exposed positions, the complete lack of fortification. Against Blackwood, we hold him off long enough for Margaret to reach the court. Once the evidence is public, Blackwood loses everything. His protection, his allies, his reason to fight. And if we cannot hold, then at least we die standing up instead of running. Silence fell over the group. The fire crackled. Somewhere in the darkness, a child whimpered in sleep. Then a boy stepped forward, 12 years old with his mother's brown hair and his father's stubborn jaw. His hands were too small for the rifle he held, but his grip was steady and his eyes were clear. I know how to shoot, he said. My father taught me before they killed him. Silas looked at the boy, looked at the determination in his face, looked at the willingness to fight that should not exist in someone so young. What is your name, Thomas? Thomas McAllister. Silas knelt so they were at eye level. Are you afraid, Thomas? Yes, sir. The boy did not hesitate. But my father said being afraid is not the same as being a coward. A coward lets fear make his choices. A brave man makes his own choices anyway. Silas felt something shift in his chest. This boy, this child who had already lost so much, was offering to fight, to stand, to do what so many grown men had refused to do. All right, Silas said, but you follow my orders. Understand? Yes, sir. And just like that, another soldier joined the war. The morning Margaret was to leave, Silas found her by the old well, checking the saddlebags of the horse she would ride. She looked up when she heard his approach, but did not stop her work. You are not an easy man to understand, she said. Neither are you an easy woman. I suppose that is why we work well together. Silas stood beside her, watching her hands move over the leather straps. You will come back, he said. It was not a question. I will come back. She finished with the bags and turned to face him. And when I do, we will finish what we started. He reached out, hesitated, then touched the scar on her wrist. Gently, the way you might touch something precious and fragile. The mountains kept me safe for 14 years, she said softly. Now it is time for people to do the same. She mounted the horse. 2 volunteers rode up beside her, young men who had nothing left to lose and everything to gain. Silas, she said, one word, his name. But in that word was everything she could not say, everything that the past week had built between them, everything that might be if they survived. Margaret. Then she kicked her heels into the horse's flanks and rode north toward Denver, toward justice, toward a future that none of them could see. Silas watched until she disappeared over the horizon. Then he heard the gunfire. From the south, a cloud of dust rose against the morning sky. Riders, many riders, coming fast. Blackwood had found them. They had hours to prepare. Maybe less. Silas turned and ran back to the ruins, his mind already calculating distances and angles and odds that were not in their favor. 23 people, 6 who could handle a weapon, 3 rifles, 5 pistols, and crumbling walls that would not stop a determined charge. Against Blackwood and however many men he had gathered. We cannot win, Ruth said when Silas explained the situation. We do not need to win, Silas replied. We just need to survive long enough for Margaret to reach Denver. How long? 3 days, maybe 4. She looked at him with eyes that had already seen too much death. Can we hold that long? Silas thought about Elijah, about the choice the old man had made, about the lesson in his dying words. We have to, he said. There is no other option. The first day was the worst. Blackwood came with 8 men, all that remained of his original force, plus new recruits picked up in Ironwood Bluff. They surrounded Red Mesa as the sun rose, cutting off the only water source, taking positions on the high ground that overlooked the ruins. Then they started shooting. Not to kill, not at first, just to terrify. Bullets cracking against stone. Dust kicking up inches from where children huddled behind rubble. The constant thunder of gunfire designed to break their spirit before the real assault began. Silas moved among the defenders, positioning them behind the thickest walls, distributing ammunition, giving orders in a calm voice that belied the chaos around them. Thomas, you take the east wall. Do not fire unless you have a clear shot. Ruth, keep the children in the cellar. Do not let them come up for anything. Everyone else hold your positions. Make every bullet count. By noon, two of Blackwood's men had stumbled into traps Silas had set during the night. One was dead, his leg torn apart by a bear trap hidden beneath a layer of dirt. The other was wounded badly enough to be out of the fight. But one of Silas's people had been hit too. A bullet through the shoulder. Not fatal, but it took another defender out of action. The second day was worse. Blackwood ordered a direct assault at dawn. His men came in two waves trying to breach the walls through sheer numbers. They failed. Silas and Thomas and the others held their ground, firing from behind cover, making every shot count. Two more of Blackwood's men went down before they retreated, but Silas took a bullet in the leg during the fighting. Clean through the calf, missing the bone by inches. He bounded himself and kept fighting, but he was slower now, less mobile. That night, the water ran out. The third day, Blackwood changed tactics. Instead of attacking, he sent a man forward under a white flag, a messenger with an offer. Give us the women, all of them, and the rest of you can leave. Silas stood on what remained of the wall, looking down at Blackwood on horseback 100 yards away. No negotiation, Silas shouted back. Not now, not ever. Blackwood smiled, that cold, empty smile that never reached his eyes. Then you all die together. The sun set on the third day, and Silas knew they could not last much longer. Ammunition was nearly gone. Half their fighters were wounded. The children had stopped crying, which was somehow worse than when they had been screaming. He sat beside Ruth in the cellar, watching Thomas sleep with a rifle clutched to his chest like a teddy bear. I am sorry, Silas said quietly. I thought we could hold longer. Ruth looked at him with eyes that had run out of tears. At least we did not run, she said. At least we stood. And then from outside, gunfire erupted. Not from Blackwood's position, from somewhere else, from the north. Silas grabbed his rifle and struggled up the stairs, ignoring the pain in his leg. He reached the surface just as the first riders came over the ridge. Cavalry, 10, maybe 12, firing into Blackwood's men from behind. And leading them, her black habit streaming behind her like a battle flag, was Margaret. She had not reached Denver. She had found something better, federal marshals, real ones, on their way to Ironwood Bluff to investigate rumors of Blackwood's corruption. Margaret had shown them the ledger, told them what was happening at Red Mesa, and they had come. Silas leaned against the ruined wall, his wounded leg finally giving out beneath him, but he was smiling. She came back, he whispered, and as the battle turned, as Blackwood's men began to surrender or flee, Silas Harrow allowed himself to believe for the first time in 14 years that maybe, just maybe, they were going to survive. Back in Ashroot, the first gray light of dawn was beginning to touch the eastern horizon. Samuel had not moved in over an hour, his eyes fixed on his grandfather's face. She came back, Samuel said softly. She came back. Silas nodded slowly. Just like she promised. What happened to Blackwood? That, Silas said, is the last part of the story. The part I need you to hear most of all. He leaned forward in his chair, his eyes finding his grandson's in the growing light. Because that is when I learned the difference between justice and revenge. And it is a lesson that might save your life in France. The chaos of battle transformed Red Mesa into a landscape of smoke and blood and desperate men fighting for survival. Federal marshals poured over the ridge like an avenging tide, their rifles cracking against the morning air, their horses churning up clouds of red dust that turned the sunrise the color of fire. Margaret rode at their head, her black habit streaming behind her, the wooden crucifix bouncing against her chest with each stride of her horse. She had not reached Denver. She had found something better. Halfway there, she had encountered the patrol, led by a man named Jacob Stone, 50 years old with silver hair and eyes that had seen too much corruption to tolerate anymore. She had shown him the ledger, told him about the siege. And Stone, who had been tracking rumors of Blackwood's activities for 3 years, had made a decision that would change everything. They rode through the night to reach Red Mesa. Now as the sun climbed higher and the battle turned, Blackwood's men began to break. 2 surrendered immediately, throwing down their weapons and raising their hands. 3 more tried to flee toward the southern pass, but Stone's men cut them off, forcing them to their knees in the dirt. That left 3 of Blackwood's original force still fighting, and Blackwood himself. Silas watched from the ruins as the tide shifted. His leg throbbed where the bullet had torn through muscle, but the pain seemed distant now, unimportant. All that mattered was what happened next. Margaret found him leaning against a crumbling wall, his rifle still in his hands, blood soaking through the makeshift bandage on his calf. "You came back," he said. "I promised I would." She slid from her horse and moved to his side, her eyes scanning his wounds with the practiced assessment of someone who had tended too many injured people. "You look terrible. I have had worse." "When 1864, he almost smiled. "That time I froze to death." Before either of them could say more, a shout went up from the eastern edge of the ruins. One of Stone's marshals was pointing toward a gap in the walls where a dark figure had just disappeared into the maze of crumbling stone. Blackwood. He was not running away from Red Mesa. He was running into it, toward the cellar where Ruth and the children were hiding, toward Margaret. Silas pushed himself off the wall, ignoring the scream of protest from his wounded leg. He grabbed his rifle and started moving. "Stay here," he told Margaret. "No." She fell into step beside him. "This ends now, together." They entered the ruins side by side, following the trail of disturbed dust and overturned debris that marked Blackwood's passage. The morning sun cast long shadows through gaps in the walls, creating a labyrinth of light and darkness that shifted with every step. Silas moved the way the Ute had taught him. Slow, careful. Every sense alert for the sound of breathing, the scrape of boot on stone, the click of a hammer being pulled back. Margaret moved beside him, her hand wrapped around the small pistol Stone had given her before the charge. She was not a warrior. She was not trained for this kind of hunting. But there was something in her eyes that Silas recognized. The look of someone who had stopped being afraid of death. They found Blackwood in what had once been the trading post's chapel. A small room with a collapsed roof open to the sky, where a wooden cross still hung crookedly on one wall. Shafts of sunlight pierced through the gaps above, creating columns of gold in the dusty air. Blackwood stood in the center of the room, his back to them, his pistol hanging at his side. He was breathing hard, his shoulders rising and falling with each ragged breath. "Harrow," he said, without turning around. 14 years. I always knew you would get in my way again." Silas raised his rifle. "It ends here, Blackwood." Now the marshal turned. His face was streaked with dust and sweat, his perfect hair disheveled, his expensive coat torn. But his eyes were the same. Cold. Empty. The eyes of a man who had looked at 230 innocent people and seen only obstacles to be removed. "Does it?" Blackwood smiled, that terrible smile. "You think you have won? You think killing me changes anything? It changes everything." "No," Blackwood shook his head slowly. "There will be others. There are always others. Men like me, men who understand that the world belongs to those strong enough to take it. You can kill one of us, but you cannot kill the idea." "Maybe not." Silas's finger tightened on the trigger. "But I can kill you." Blackwood moved. He was faster than Silas expected, faster than a man his age had any right to be. His pistol came up in a blur of motion, the hammer already falling as the barrel aligned with Silas's chest. The shot went wide. Not because Blackwood missed, but because Margaret had thrown herself forward, at the same instant her shoulder slamming into Silas and knocking him sideways. The bullet that should have killed him tore through the air, where his heart had been a fraction of a second before. Silas hit the ground hard, his wounded legs screaming in protest. His rifle flew from his hands, clattering across the stone floor. Blackwood pivoted, bringing his pistol around to finish the job. And Silas, weaponless, wounded, and desperate, did the only thing he could. He charged. 175 pounds of rage and pain and 14 years of guilt slammed into Blackwood like a battering ram. They went down together, crashing against the ancient stone floor, fighting for control of the pistol still clutched in Blackwood's hand. Blackwood was strong, stronger than Silas had anticipated. Years of comfortable living had not softened him the way it softened most men. He twisted beneath Silas, driving his knee up into the wound on Silas's leg. The pain was blinding. White-hot agony that shot through his entire body and made his vision swim with stars. Blackwood used the moment to roll them over, pinning Silas beneath his weight. His hands found Silas's throat and began to squeeze. "You should have stayed in the mountains," Blackwood hissed, his face inches away, his eyes burning with cold fury. "You should have died like the coward you are." Silas could not breathe. The world was going dark at the edges, narrowing to a tunnel that contained only Blackwood's face and those empty, merciless eyes. His hands scrabbled against the stone floor, searching for something, anything. His fingers found the handle of his Bowie knife. He had dropped it when he fell. Or maybe it had been knocked loose during the struggle. It did not matter. What mattered was that it was there, solid and real, 12 inches of steel that had saved his life more times than he could count. Silas pulled the knife free and drove it upward with every ounce of strength he had left. The blade entered beneath Blackwood's ribs, angling up toward the heart. Blackwood's eyes went wide. His grip on Silas's throat loosened. A sound escaped his lips. Not a scream, not a cry of pain, but something closer to surprise. As if after all these years he had never truly believed that someone like Silas could beat someone like him. "You, Blackwood," whispered blood, bubbling at the corner of his mouth. "You think you have won." Silas twisted the knife. "I think you are dead." Blackwood laughed, a wet, choking sound that ended in a cough. "There will be others, always others. Then we will fight them too." Silas met the dying man's eyes without flinching. "One at a time, for as long as it takes," something flickered in Blackwood's gaze. Fear, perhaps. Or finally, at the very end, understanding. Then the light went out of his eyes, and Josiah Blackwood, the monster of Sand Creek, slumped forward and was still. Silas lay beneath the body for a long moment, unable to move. His throat burned where Blackwood's fingers had dug in. His leg felt like someone had set it on fire. His hands were slick with blood that was not his own. Then Margaret was there, pulling Blackwood's corpse away, helping Silas sit up. "It is over," she said. Silas looked at the body of the man who had haunted his nightmares for 14 years. At the empty eyes that would never again order the death of innocents. At the hands that would never again sign away the lives of children. "Yes," he said quietly, "it is over." But even as he spoke the words, he knew they were not entirely true. Blackwood was dead, but the world that had created him remained. The corruption, the greed, the casual cruelty of men who saw other human beings as property to be bought and sold. That would never be truly over. All they could do was keep fighting, one battle at a time, one life at a time, until there was no more breath in their bodies. Margaret helped Silas to his feet, supporting him as they made their way out of the ruined chapel. The sun was fully up now, painting Red Mesa in shades of gold and rose. The sounds of battle had faded, replaced by the quieter noises of aftermath. Men being bound and led away. Wounds being tended. The living sorting themselves from the dead. Marshal Stone found them near the old well where Ruth was already organizing the refugees into work parties. "Blackwood?" Stone asked. "Dead," Silas replied. Stone nodded once, his weathered face showing neither satisfaction nor disappointment. Just acknowledgement of a job completed. "The ledger is enough to bring down his entire operation," Stone said. "Every corrupt official, every buyer, every seller. It will take months to sort through, but when we are done, there will be a lot of empty cells in federal prisons." "And the girls?" Margaret asked. "The ones in hiding. Once word gets out that Blackwood is dead, they can come forward safely." Stone looked at her with something like respect. "You did good work, sister. Dangerous work, but good." Margaret touched the wooden crucifix at her throat. Grace's crucifix. "It was not about me," she said quietly. "It was about them." The next hours passed in a blur of activity. The wounded were treated, the dead were buried. Blackwood's surviving men were bound and loaded onto horses for the long ride to the nearest federal courthouse. Silas sat on a pile of rubble, his leg properly bandaged now with supplies from Stone's medical kit, and watched the sun climb toward noon. Margaret found him there. "Marshal Stone says we can stay here," she said, settling onto the rubble beside him. "The trading post belongs to no one now. The Spanish claims expired decades ago. If we want it, it is ours." She looked at him, her brown eyes steady. "Unless you are planning to go back to your cabin, back to the mountains, back to being alone." Silas thought about the cabin, the silence. The 14 years of solitude that had not healed anything had only delayed the reckoning that was always coming. He thought about Eleanor and Mary buried in the cemetery he had not visited in 2 decades. He thought about Elijah lying beneath a lone oak tree with a smile on his face and the knowledge that his sacrifice had meant something. And he thought about the ring in his pocket, E&S forever. "No," he said finally, "I am not going back." Margaret's hand found his. Her fingers were rough with calluses, her palm warm despite the morning chill. "Good," she said, "because there is work to do." 6 months later, Red Mesa had a new name. They called it Ashroot. Margaret had suggested it one evening as they sat around a fire watching the children play in the dust. Something that grows from ashes, she said. Something that refuses to die, no matter how much it has been burned. The name stuck. The old trading post had been transformed. Walls rebuilt with stone quarried from the nearby cliffs. A roof that kept out the rain and the snow. New buildings rising around it, a cluster of homes and workshops and stables that grew larger with each passing month. Silas worked from dawn to dusk, teaching the younger men how to fell trees and notch logs, how to build structures that would stand against the mountain winters. His hands, which had spent 14 years doing nothing but survive, now learned the different kind of calluses that came from creation instead of destruction. Margaret opened a school in the largest of the new buildings. She taught reading and writing to children who had never held a book to adults who had never learned their letters. Her classroom smelled of chalk dust and hope. Ruth became the settlement's unofficial mayor, organizing work schedules and settling disputes, making sure everyone had enough to eat. Her son Thomas, the boy who had stood up with a rifle too big for his hands, became something like a son to Silas and Margaret. Not officially, not legally, but in all the ways that mattered. And the people kept coming. They arrived in twos and threes at first, then in larger groups. Farmers who had lost their land to drought or foreclosure. Miners whose claims had been stolen by men with better lawyers. Former slaves who had fled the South only to find that freedom in the North came with its own set of chains. They came from everywhere, these refugees, from a world that had used them up and thrown them away. And Ashroot welcomed them all. By March, the population had grown to 35. By June, 58. By September, 84 souls called Ashroot home. And then Colonel Wade Sterling arrived. He rode in on an autumn morning when the aspens had turned gold and the air carried the first bite of approaching winter. 20 men behind him, all armed, all wearing the hard faces of men who had learned that violence was easier than work. Sterling himself was a study in contradictions. 44 years old with the bearing of a military officer in the eyes of a predator. He had fought for the Union during the war, risen to the rank of colonel, and then discovered that peace offered fewer opportunities for advancement than conflict. Now he led the Copper Ridge Gang, a loose confederation of outlaws who controlled the territory north of Red Mesa. They did not steal exactly. They collected taxes, protection money, tribute. Call it what you wanted. The result was the same. Sterling reined his horse to a stop in the center of Ashroot's main street, his eyes sweeping over the buildings and the people and the obvious signs of prosperity. "I hear you folks are doing well for yourselves," he said, his voice carrying easily in the morning quiet. "Fresh water, good farmland, growing population." Impressive. Silas stepped forward from the crowd that had gathered. He walked without a limp now, 6 months of healing, having restored most of his mobility. But his hand rested near his pistol and his eyes never left Sterling's face. "What do you want?" Sterling smiled. It was a politician's smile, all teeth and no warmth. "Just a simple arrangement. 10% of everything you produce. Every month. In exchange, my men will make sure no one bothers you. Think of it as insurance. Insurance against what? Against people like me." Sterling's smile widened. "Come now, Harrow. I know who you are. I know what happened to Blackwood. You are not a stupid man. You know how this works." Silas was quiet for a moment. Behind him, he could feel the eyes of the community. Ruth and Thomas, the farmers and the miners, and the families who had come here looking for something better. "No," he said. Sterling's smile faltered. "Excuse me. No arrangement, no payments, no tribute." Silas's voice was calm, almost conversational. "This is our home. We built it. We will defend it. And if you want to take anything from us, you will have to come and take it." For a long moment, Sterling just stared at him. Then he laughed, a short bark of genuine amusement. "You have spirit, Harrow. I will give you that. But spirit does not stop bullets." Sterling gathered his reins. "I will give you 1 week to reconsider. After that, well," he shrugged. "We will see how much that spirit is worth." He turned his horse and rode out of Ashroot, his men following in a cloud of dust and unspoken threats. That night, the community gathered. Not in the church, which had become the largest building in the settlement, in the open beneath the stars where everyone could see and be heard. "We could pay," one of the farmers said. 10% is not so much. Better than dying. It will not stop at 10%. Silas's voice was quiet but carried easily in the still air. Men like Sterling never stop taking. This year 10%, next year 20. Then he takes the land itself and we are right back where we started. Then what do we do? Ruth asked. We fight. The word hung in the air like smoke. Margaret stood up from where she had been sitting with the children. When she spoke, her voice was steady and clear. We fight, she repeated, not because we want violence, but because there is no other choice. If we show them that we will not surrender, that we will defend what is ours, they will find easier targets. And if we lose the farmer again, his face pale in the firelight, then at least we lose with dignity. Margaret looked around at the faces surrounding her, at the people who had come here with nothing and built something from the ashes of their old lives. We have already lost everything once. Most of us have. That is why we are here. And we survived. We can survive this too. Silence. Then Thomas, now 13 years old and taller than his mother, stood up. I will fight, he said. One by one others rose, men and women, young and old, until the entire community was standing united in a decision that would determine their future. Silas looked at them, these people who had become his family. Then he looked at Margaret standing beside him with firelight dancing in her eyes. All right, he said. Then we have work to do. The week that followed was a blur of preparation. Silas drew on everything he had learned in the war and in 14 years of survival. He organized work parties to dig trenches around the perimeter. He positioned sharpshooters on the rooftops, giving them clear fields of fire toward every approach. He set traps along the likely avenues of attack using techniques the Ute had taught him for catching larger and more dangerous prey. Every adult who could hold a weapon was trained. Not to be soldiers, they did not have time for that, but to shoot straight and take cover and not panic when the bullets started flying. Every child was assigned to the cellars with strict instructions to stay hidden until someone came for them. And through it all, Margaret moved among the people, calming fears, offering encouragement, reminding them what they were fighting for. Sterling came on the 7th day. He brought 25 men this time, 5 more than before. They approached from the south, riding in a loose formation that suggested confidence. Why worry about tactics when you outnumbered your enemy 3-1? But Sterling had miscounted. He had assumed that Ashroot's defenders would be the same ragtag group of refugees he had seen a week ago. What he found instead was a community transformed. Trenches 4 feet deep ringed the settlement. Barricades of stone and timber blocked every street. And behind those barricades, 30 men and women waited with rifles and pistols and the desperate courage of people with nowhere left to run. Sterling halted his men 100 yards from the outer trenches. Last chance, Harrow, he called out. Pay the tax and we ride away. Nobody has to die today. Silas stood on the main barricade, his Sharp's rifle cradled in his arms. The only thing you are getting from us, he called back, is a grave if you are stupid enough to charge. Sterling's face darkened. He turned to his men, said something too quiet for Silas to hear. Then they charged. The first wave hit the eastern trenches and immediately ran into trouble. 3 of Sterling's men went down in the first 10 seconds, caught in the crossfire from positions they had not even seen. A 4th stumbled into a concealed pit and broke his leg. A 5th took a bullet from Ruth McAllister, who had discovered in the past week that she was a better shot than most of the men. Sterling tried to swing around to the west, looking for a weak point in the defenses. Instead, he found Thomas and a group of women armed with shotguns, who filled the air with lead at close range and sent the attackers reeling back. The battle lasted 2 hours. When it was over, 8 of Sterling's men lay dead or dying in the dust. Another 6 were wounded badly enough that they would not fight again. The rest had retreated to a safe distance, their confidence shattered by an enemy that had refused to behave like victims. But Sterling himself was still out there, and as long as he was alive, Silas knew he would be a threat. So when Sterling rode forward under a white flag calling for a parley, Silas went to meet him. One-on-one, Sterling said, his face was streaked with dirt and powder smoke, and there was a new wariness in his eyes. Winner takes all. You win, we ride away and never come back. I win, your people surrender peacefully. Margaret grabbed Silas's arm as he turned to go. Do not, she said. You do not have to prove anything. This is not about proving. Silas looked at her, at the face that had become more familiar to him than his own. This is about ending it, once and for all. He walked out to meet Sterling in the no-man's land between the barricades and the retreating outlaws. They faced each other in the afternoon sun, two men who had chosen very different paths in life. "You know you cannot win," Sterling said quietly. "Even if you beat me, there will be others. There are always others." Silas thought about Blackwood saying almost the same words as he died. Maybe he said, "But you will not be one of them." Sterling drew first. He was faster than Blackwood had been, his hand a blur as it swept toward his holster. But Silas did not try to outdraw him. Instead, he did what he had done in the chapel 6 months ago. He charged. Sterling's bullet took him in the shoulder, the same shoulder that already bore the scar from his fight with Blackwood. The impact spun him half around, but he did not stop. He kept coming, closing the distance between them before Sterling could fire again. They collided with a crash that sent both men tumbling to the ground. But Silas was ready for it this time. He rolled with the impact, came up on top, and drove his fist into Sterling's face with all the force of a lifetime's accumulated rage. Once, twice, 3 times. Sterling stopped struggling. Silas stood swaying slightly from blood loss and looked down at the man who had thought he could take everything they had built. "I do not need to kill you," he said. "But I will if you ever come back." Sterling stared up at him, his face a mask of blood and broken pride. "All right," he said finally, "all right. We will not come back." He was as good as his word. The Copper Ridge gang rode away that afternoon and never returned to Ashroot. And that night, as Margaret bandaged his new wound and the community celebrated their survival with songs and laughter, Silas allowed himself to believe for the first time since Eleanor and Mary had died that he might actually have found a place where he belonged. The years that followed were not easy. Nothing worth having ever is. They faced drought and disease and the ordinary tragedies that come with living in a hard land. They buried children who died too young and elders who died too old. They celebrated weddings and mourned losses, and slowly, year by year, built something that had never existed before. A community where the color of your skin did not matter, where your past was your own business, where the only thing that counted was whether you were willing to work hard and treat your neighbors with respect. Thomas grew up tall and strong with his father's stubbornness and his mother's kindness. He married a girl named Sarah, one of the original 7 who had escaped from St. Catherine's with Margaret. They had a son of their own, a boy they named Samuel. And Silas and Margaret, who had never officially married, who had never needed a ceremony to know what they meant to each other, grew old together in the house Silas had built on the edge of town. They never forgot the people they had lost. Grace's grave in the cemetery was always kept clean, always decorated with fresh flowers. Elijah's resting place beneath the lone oak became a place of pilgrimage where people went when they needed to remember that sacrifice was not the same as defeat. And every year on the anniversary of the Battle of Red Mesa, the entire community gathered to tell the story, to make sure that the children knew where they had come from, to make sure that no one ever forgot the price that had been paid for their freedom. In 1908, 30 years after Silas had found Margaret dying in a canyon, Ashroot was a thriving town of over 500 people. The main street was called Elijah's Way. The second street was called Grace's Lane. The 6 surviving girls from St. Catherine's had all found their way here eventually. Sarah ran a bakery that was famous throughout the territory. Elizabeth taught at the school Margaret had founded. Mary had married a farmer and raised 4 children of her own. Hannah, Abigail, and Rachel each built lives that would have been impossible anywhere else. And in the cemetery on the hill overlooking town, a simple headstone marked Grace Whitmore's final resting place. The inscription read, "She ran so others could be free." Margaret visited that grave every Sunday after church. She would stand there in her black dress, now faded gray with age, and speak to the girl she had failed to save, telling her about the community that had grown from her sacrifice, about the lives that had been changed, about the legacy that would continue long after all of them had turned to dust. "I kept my promise," Margaret would say. "I told your story, and they will never forget." Back in Ashroot, 1917, the first true light of dawn was spreading across the eastern sky. Samuel sat on the porch steps, his army uniform wrinkled from a night of sitting, his young face aged by the weight of everything he had heard. Silas rose from his rocking chair and walked slowly to the edge of the porch. His joints protested the movement, as they always did these days, but he ignored them. There were more important things than pain. "Samuel," he said. "Yes, grandfather." "Come here." The young man rose and joined his grandfather at the railing. Together, they looked out at Ashroot as it began to wake. Smoke rising from chimneys. The first early risers moving through the streets. The sound of a rooster somewhere in the distance. Do you see all this, Silas asked? Yes. This is what happens when people stand up instead of walking away. When they fight for what is right instead of hiding from what is hard. Silas turned to face his grandson. I am not going to lie to you. What you will face in France will be terrible. Worse than anything I ever saw. Men will die. Good men, friends. And there will be times when you want to give up, want to run, want to pretend that none of it matters. Samuel nodded slowly, his eyes bright with unshed tears. But it does matter, Silas continued. Every choice matters. Every time you stand up or walk away. Every time you help a wounded man or leave him in the mud. You are deciding who you are. And you will have to live with those decisions for the rest of your life. He reached into his pocket and withdrew the silver ring that he had carried for 39 years. The ring that Elijah had kept for 14 years before that. The ring that Eleanor had worn on the day they married in another lifetime in a world that no longer existed. E.N.S. Forever. This belonged to your great-grandmother, Silas said. Eleanor. Elijah kept it for me all those years. He never told me why. Maybe he knew that someday I would need to pass it on. He pressed the ring into Samuel's palm. Take it with you, to remind you that there is always someone waiting for you to come home. That no matter how dark things get, there is always something worth fighting for. Samuel stared at the ring, then looked up at his grandfather. I will come back, he said. Yes, you will. They stood together in silence as the sun rose higher, painting ashroot in shades of gold and rose. In the distance, they could hear the sound of an approaching wagon. Samuel's transportation to the train station. The front door opened, and Margaret stepped out onto the porch. At 73, her hair was white as snow, and her face was lined with the map of a life fully lived. But her eyes were still warm, still bright with the fire that had never been extinguished. She crossed to Samuel and embraced him, holding him the way she had held so many children over the years. The lost ones, the saved ones, the ones who had come to Ashroot looking for hope and found a home instead. You come back, she said. It was not a request. It was a command issued with all the authority of a woman who had stared down death and won. I will, grandmother. She released him and stepped back, standing beside Silas. Together they watched as Samuel climbed into the wagon, as the driver clicked to his horses, as the vehicle began to move down the dirt road that led to the station. Samuel looked back once, raising his hand in farewell. Silas and Margaret raised their hands in return. Then the wagon crested the hill and disappeared from view. Margaret took Silas's hand. Her grip was still strong despite the years, her palms still warm. Do you think he will be all right, she asked. I think, Silas said slowly, he is ready to decide what kind of man he is going to be. They stood on the porch for a long time after that, watching the sun climb over the town they had built from nothing. The town that had grown from ashes and blood and stubborn refusal to surrender. Around them, Ashroot came to life. Children laughing on their way to school. Merchants opening their shops. Farmers heading out to their fields. The ordinary sounds of a community that had survived against all odds and learned to thrive. This is your legacy, Silas, Margaret said quietly. All of this, our legacy, he corrected. Ours and Elijah's and Grace's and everyone who gave something so that others could have more. Margaret leaned her head against his shoulder. Do you ever regret it? She asked. Leaving your cabin, coming down from the mountains, Silas thought about the question. About the 14 years of silence that had preceded their meeting. About the life he had lived before, alone with his ghosts and his guilt. No, he said. The only thing I regret is the years I wasted thinking that walking away was enough. Margaret smiled. It was the same smile she had given him in the canyon all those years ago when he had told her that he was not going to leave her to die. Then we have no regrets, she said. Only gratitude. They stood together on the porch as the morning brightened around them. An old man and an old woman holding hands like they had held hands through decades of struggle and triumph and love. Behind them, Ashroot hummed with life. Before them, the San Juan Mountains rose against the sky, ancient and eternal, keeping their secrets the way they always had. And somewhere on a train heading east, a young man named Samuel Harrow clutched a silver ring in his pocket and thought about the story his grandfather had told him, about the price of silence, about the cost of standing up, about the legacy that was now his to carry. He would go to France. He would face the horrors that awaited him there. And when it was over, he would come home. Not because his grandfather had told him to, but because he understood now what his grandfather had been trying to teach him. That home was not a place. It was a promise, a commitment to the people who loved you, a decision to keep fighting, keep building, keep hoping even when everything seemed lost. Samuel closed his eyes as the train rocked beneath him, carrying him toward an uncertain future. But he was not afraid anymore. He was ready. In Ashrut, the sun continued to rise. Margaret went inside to start breakfast. Silas remained on the porch for a few more minutes, his eyes on the distant mountains that had sheltered him for so many years. He thought about Elijah lying beneath his oak tree, about Grace, whose sacrifice had started everything, about Eleanor and Mary waiting for him in whatever came next. Soon he would join them. He could feel it in his bones the way old men feel the approach of winter. Another year, maybe two. His body was wearing out the way all bodies did eventually. But that was all right. He had done what he came to do. He had stood up when it mattered. He had helped build something that would outlast him, something that would continue long after his name was forgotten. And he had passed the torch to the next generation. That was enough. That was more than enough. Silas smiled, a rare expression that transformed his weathered face. Then he turned and walked inside, where Margaret was waiting with coffee and the comfortable silence of two people who no longer needed words to say everything that mattered. Outside, the wind whispered through Ashrut's streets, carrying with it the voices of all those who had come before, the lost and the saved, the fighters and the fallen, the ones who had given everything so that others might have something. And if you listened carefully, if you stood very still and let the sounds of the living fade into the background, you could almost hear them speaking. We were here. We stood up. We built something from the ashes, and our story will never end. Samuel did come back. 2 years later in 1919, missing his left arm, but not his spirit. He married a girl from Ashrut named Catherine. They had 3 children, and he told them the same story his grandfather had told him on the same porch looking out at the same mountains. Margaret died in 1920, peacefully in her sleep with Silas holding her hand. Silas followed 3 years later in 1923. They buried him beside her in the cemetery on the hill where Grace Whitmore's headstone stood like a sentinel over the town that had grown from sacrifice and hope. Their graves bore a single inscription, one that Margaret had chosen before she died. From the ashes we rise, and Ashrut lived on. Through the Great Depression and World War II and all the changes that came after. Through generations of families who were born there and grew old there and passed down the story of how it all began. A story about a man who found a woman dying in a canyon. About the choice he made to save her, about the community they built together against all odds. A story about the price of silence and the power of standing up. A story that would never truly end as long as there were people willing to tell it. And somewhere in whatever place awaits us after this world is done, Silas, Harrow, and Margaret Cole and Elijah Crow, Feather and Grace Whitmore looked down at what they had helped create, and they smiled. Because in the end, that was all any of them had ever wanted. Not glory, not revenge, not even survival. Just the knowledge that their lives had mattered. That they had left the world a little better than they had found it. That the people who came after them would have a chance to build something beautiful on the foundation they had laid. That was their legacy. That was their gift. That was everything.